IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to the IVM Podcast Network. Wow, we're dealing with some stuff, aren't we? The COVID-19 scare we're facing in India and the world has, it's really changed our lives, hasn't it? But it's also seriously impacted our ability to create podcasts and to get them out to you on schedule. For the next few weeks, I'd like to ask for your patience if episodes are delayed or postponed. We're also going to be doing many of the recordings remotely, like this one, for example, right? And sound quality is going to be a little uneven while we're facing this time, right? If you want to listen to discussions about COVID, we have had conversations on Cider Says, the Prakati Podcast, Thale Arate, All Things Policy, The Habit Coach, and other shows as well, right? So, please do continue to stay tuned, and we will be talking about this stuff, and we'll be talking about life in general. Also want to thank our sponsors this week, HDFC Life and Paytm Money. So let's get on with this, and I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yuddha is for adults. It contains graphic depictions of violence against humans and animals. If you feel you'll be triggered by the accounts of violence in this podcast, it's best you skip through those bits. That said, on to the episode.
Welcome to Yuddha, the Indian Military History Podcast. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti.
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan.
And we're joined today by a very special guest, our friend Malvika Pradhan, who, just like us, is a military history nerd.
Hi guys, thanks for having me over.
Okay, so thank you guys both for joining me, and thank you, our wonderful listeners, for joining us in today's episode. So as you might already know from our last episode, we have followed the military history of India from the very beginning of the 10th century in the deep south. We've looked at how elephants were used in warfare. We looked at the fascinating medieval military aristocratic culture of southern India. And we've also looked at the military aristocratic culture of another part of the world. We've looked at Central Asia, and we looked in the last episode in great detail at the fascinating and turbulent personalities roughly around the late 10th to early 11th centuries. So we discussed a whole bunch of stuff. I don't really have time to go over it all right now. You guys are absolutely welcome to listen to the previous part of this episode because it kind of lays down a lot of context that you're going to find useful while listening to this episode. But the TLDR of it is that we looked quite extensively at the geopolitics of the Middle East. We looked at the decline and fall of the great Islamic powers of the 7th and 8th centuries. We looked at the rise of a bunch of ambitious new Central Asian warlords, families including, for example, the Ghaznavids. We looked at Muhammad of Ghor. We looked at his relationship with India, and finally we saw the decline and fall of the Ghaznavids and their eclipsing by a new power in Afghanistan called the Ghurids. So what we're going to be doing over the course of this episode is first trying to understand a little bit more about who exactly these Ghurids were. Why did they want to do the things that they were doing? And then we'll introduce you once again to a character who came up in our last episode, Muhammad of Ghor, and we're going to look at his rivalry with the North Indian king Prithviraj Chauhan, who is a household name in many parts of India. We are going to look at how these Turkish warlords basically made North India their playground for nearly the course of a century. And we're going to draw parallels between that and another equally transformative moment in global history, which was the Crusades. So hang in there. We have a bunch of really, really interesting stuff to talk about in this episode. So without any further ado, let's first talk about the Ghurids. It's kind of strange how the Ghurids do things, right? So we've talked a great deal about how a lot of these upstart new dynasties in the broader Iran-Turan region are basically warlords, criminals who now set themselves up as kings. And the Ghurids make absolutely no pretense about the fact that they are out to make money, they are out to conquer land, and they are out to get wealthy and get as powerful as they possibly can. We know that every male member of the senior Ghurid dynasty, if we can use that term, had large number of concubines, very often slave women who, again, we've discussed sexual violence, but I think we should once again emphasize the fact that it's absolutely universal. There's no getting around it anywhere in the medieval world. And the children that they had with these women, the sons were usually given a new parcel of land, a new bit of territory, and they were left to themselves. Now, every Ghurid prince was basically raised from childhood knowing that he was a product of a highly troubled family, knowing that he would be given essentially land to himself and left to himself. He would be responsible for defending his territory from his brothers, from other princes, and he would be responsible for his own personal advancement, nobody else. So that's how you really have to see this strange individual called Muiz ad-Din of Ghor, because though his brother has ostensibly said, you know what, I'm going to look at the western part of the empire, the east is yours, his brother's not going to come and save him, his brother's not going to come and help him out. for Muiz to make a name for himself, for Muiz to feel powerful, for Muiz to assuage his inner demons. He is responsible. And in a lot of ways, as you mentioned, now the Ghurs have moved in. The Ghurids, even though they originally start as basically settled people who are doing agriculture, have now become the leaders of this vast network of patronage that's so deeply connected to the markets of Central Asia that has absolutely smashed Ghazna, their one great rival. And keep in mind that Ghazna, for whatever it's worth, had kind of figured out a way to coexist with Indian kings. We have a number of Sanskrit inscriptions which actually describe Ghaznavids as Garjanakas. So we know that in a sense, these guys were aware of each other. They were aware that they were part of the same kind of political culture. But in a lot of ways, the Ghurids are different. The Ghurids are a lot more, how do I put this? As they did with Ghazna, they want to see the world burn. So now Muiz starts to gather up an army of ghulams for himself, an army of Ghazi ghulams, of course. And he tells them that we are going to go and raid India.
And of course, when you talk about raiding India, what better raid to emulate than that famed one on Somnath? Muizuddin needs something spectacular to get him started. And so in 1178-79, he takes this polyglot army of his, which includes Ghurs, which includes other Turks, which includes Ghurids, Khalajis, who are another Afghan people.
Which we mentioned earlier in this episode.
Yeah. And as this army makes its way through the Gholam Pass, they of course attack the Ismailis of Multan, which is almost a ritual by now for anyone based out of Ghazni. And then they head into Gujarat. The little problem is there's the Thar Desert. Now, we talked about Mahmud of Ghazni's raid and how this actually involved a fair deal of logistical preparation from what we know. Mahmud's army was largely cavalry. It included a large number of pack animals, especially camels. And so they had planned an expedition through a desert properly. Apparently, Muizuddin had not. And so his army came out of the desert, parched, devastated, weak.
I mean, he seems like the kind of person who would still have expected that things were going to go his way.
Which, of course, they didn't, because the Chaulukyas of Gujarat went and smashed him. Persian sources refer to the elephants of the Chaulukyas, so clearly those made an impression. We don't know beyond that the details of the battle, except that he returned to Ghazni with his tail between his legs.
Now, the Chaulukyas of Gujarat are one of medieval India's most interesting dynasties. And I say this as a medieval India nerd who says that about most dynasties that I talk about in podcasts. But the Chaulukyas are extraordinarily wealthy because of trade. These guys had been around during Mahmud of Ghazni's raid into Somnath. It might very well be possible that it was because of the approach of an actual Chaulukya army that Mahmud beat such a hasty retreat and ended up getting lost in the desert and so on and so forth. But I think it's worth stepping back now and kind of understanding the new geopolitical context within which Muiz is operating. We touched upon how Indian states have already figured out how to deal with cavalry armies. The Chaulukyas are a great example of that. Even though they're quite a distance away from any possible Turkic raids, they have still invested in figuring out how to send these invaders back. The reason being that Mahmud had started a broader pattern, again, something that we touched upon a little earlier, the fact that now you have a very large number of adventurers who just get some goons together and think that they can raid India, and Indian kings have to defend against that, and they seem to have been broadly successful on that front. But of course, just as with the Ghaznavids, the periphery is not the only thing the Indian kings have to worry about. What we're seeing in North India at this time is the emergence of this almost bipolarity between the Chaulukyas of Gujarat and a dynasty that is probably much more familiar to listeners, the Chahamanas of the broader northwest frontier region. Now, the Chahamanas might be more familiar to people with the name Chauhan, and they would soon prove to be Muiz's greatest challenge in actually getting into northern India. One of the reasons why Muiz is likely to have gone to Gujarat first was because he would have thought that Indian kings weren't prepared in that direction. Maybe because he had heard of competition between the Chaulukyas and the Chahamanas, who were both competing for influence over the broader northern Rajasthan region. And also because there was still a rump Ghaznavid presence in the Punjab. These guys were still fighting with the Chahamanas. Now, we mentioned Bahram Shah of the Ghaznavids, who was actually defeated by the Ghurid ruler Alauddin and he actually ended up fleeing to Punjab. And there he came into contact with this vigorous, violent Chahamana king called Vigraha Raja. Now, Vigraha Raja is a guy who seems in many ways really the classical medieval Indian king, right? Just a quick aside, I know you guys were expecting a different something Raja, Chauhan, but I'm not going to talk about him for a little while. But yes, coming back to Vigraha Raja. Vigraha Raja does a lot of stuff in his career. Let me give you an example. According to one rock inscription, Vigraha Raja burnt Jalore, reduced Pali to a hamlet and Nadol to a marsh.
Nice guy.
Nice guy. And where are all these places? Surely such a great defender of Indian civilization must only have been doing all this stuff in Afghanistan against the evil Turks, right? No. This was a minor branch of the Chauhan family of the Chahamanas, who apparently didn't get along with the senior branch as headed by Vigraha Raja. So he absolutely leveled them to the dust. This was a man who was absolutely not willing to take any criticism. And of course, in the classical medieval Indian kingly style, he commissions great works of literature. He commissions something called the Lalita Vigraha Raja Nataka, which means the drama of the gentle Vigraha Raja. And as you can tell, he's also not above being disingenuous when the time calls for it. It's a highly dramatized story where he's competing to win the hand of a beautiful princess, as kings do, and the play is interesting because it explicitly mentions that he's also gathering a great army to fight one individual called Hammira, which is obviously a Sanskritized depiction of emir. So this might very well be a reference to Bahram Shah. And what happens when Vigraha Raja gets into contact with this Turk? Is it, as we're led to believe, a totally one-sided contest where the cavalry archers always defeated the slow and ponderous elephant? Not at all. According to an inscription that he left somewhere in the Himalayan foothills, he's supposed to have made Aryavarta once more. What this means is that Arya literally means noble land. So there's an implication here that he has somehow cleansed the lands of a presence. And what is this presence that he has cleansed it of? The barbarian Mlechas, who he, and I quote, exterminated. Now, we've talked a lot about how Turks were Ghazis and so on and so forth, and how these guys didn't see their rivals necessarily as human beings, and were absolutely convinced that if they died in battle, then they would be rewarded in heaven and so on and so forth. But let's not pretend like the people that they were fighting were any different. The idea that all human beings are human beings was quite a radical thought in the medieval world, and it is not something that any medieval king, whether Hindu or Muslim, would have subscribed to, and it definitely does not seem like this Vigraha Raja did that.
Speaking of absolutely ruthless royals, Muizuddin. Now, this guy is back in Ghazna. He's licking his wounds after his disastrous expedition to Gujarat. And he needs again to show his strength to people in his network of patronage. And he also needs to offer loot to this army of his.
He's got to make money. I'm sure the guy lost a huge amount of money, just aside from the blow to his prestige and his, of course, his personal ego. He must have lost a great deal in this. So now the stakes for him are just so much higher.
Yeah. So now where do you go? Sindh is kind of already in your control. The way to go now into the subcontinent is through the plains of Punjab. And this is where also the remnants of the old Ghaznavid Empire remain.
Wow. Fascinating. Who would have thought?
Yep. And so the Ghaznavids, what remained of them, really had enemies on two sides. They had the Chauhans on the east and the Ghors to the west. And so every winter he launches these raids into Punjab, basically meant to weaken these guys, and slowly consolidates his power over Punjab. Now, where do you go next? You head further down into the plains, into what is now Haryana, and of course that tiny little provincial town that we know of as Delhi. And so in 1191, Muizuddin takes an army and marches out straight through the plains and takes this fort called Tabar Hind, which is in what is today Indian Punjab. And he leaves provisions in this fort. Now, leaving provisions in a fort is a sign of intent. It means you're there to stay. It means you're going to use it as a staging post. This is not a simple plundering expedition.
I'd like to pause you there to just call out one particularly interesting fact, and that is that this fort existed in the first place at such a strategic location that Muiz knew that he could use it to stage operations deeper into India when the time came, which at least to me implies that it might have also initially have been used as a staging post to send raids into the Punjab. And the only people who in North India who were willing to do that at the time were the Chahamanas. And I can't help but think that this must have been part of a broader network of frontier fortifications that the Chahamanas used basically to send warnings of when raids were coming, that they had figured out a system, a military system that was organized enough to defend against raids from a wide variety of nomadic or horse riding actors. And the Chahamana king that Muiz was now coming into contact with was not Vigraha Raja, but his nephew, Prithvi Raja III, now immortalized, of course, in Hindi literature as Prithviraj Chauhan.
It's really interesting that you point out that Tabar Hind was part of a network of strategic forts. By our best guess today, one of the reasons we are not exactly sure which fort it is precisely because there are so many forts in the region. And by our best guess, it is the fort of Bhatinda. Now, today, Bhatinda is the staging post of the Indian Army's 10th Corps.
Oh my, wow. How history rhymes.
Exactly.
Or if I can self-promote, echoes.
So, taking a fort and leaving provisions there, like I said, is a signal of intent. And so Prithviraj, our man, rises to the challenge. And of course, now these two armies clash at Tarain. And we don't really have a lot of details about what happened, but even the Persian sources agree that they were routed.
That's a big admission coming from them.
Yes. And while we don't have details about how this rout occurred, we do have one of the chroniclers, Minhaj, talk about an encounter between one of Prithviraj's generals, Govindraj, and Muizuddin himself. According to the story, Govindraj was on an elephant and heading towards Muizuddin, and Muizuddin used his own lance to take a stab at Govindraj. Govindraj had a few teeth knocked out, but Govindraj in turn hurled a lance or a javelin at Muizuddin. He was badly injured in the upper arm and obviously started bleeding quite badly and was going to faint, when we are told that a Khalaji soldier immediately came to the rescue, leapt upon Muizuddin's horse and steadied him and took him away from the battlefield. And of course, when a king is off the battlefield and when it looks like maybe he's going to die, not make it, this army starts collapsing and the Chauhans are left with the battlefield.
I was just on tenterhooks this entire time because I haven't read about the first battle of Tarain in too much detail. But there's so many things that really beg for attention. The first is that history quite literally tottered on a spear point. In that one moment, so many things could have changed. The history of the world could have been so profoundly different if Govindaraja's spear had hit maybe a little deeper, maybe just a few inches to a different direction. And in a lot of ways, this reminds me of the Battle of the Granicus River, which was one of Alexander the Great's earliest battles, where he actually very daringly kind of crossed the river, put himself in danger's way, and was on the verge of actually being killed by a Persian soldier when he was saved by one of his bodyguards. And just imagine if Alexander had not been saved, the Persian Empire would have perhaps survived for centuries longer. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if Muiz had actually died on that fateful day. The second thing that I'd like to call your attention to is we've talked in the previous episode in a great deal of detail about the military culture of medieval India, about the fact that these kings, these vassals, these generals are supposed to be militarily capable. They're supposed to be good at killing people. And they're supposed to set an example for their men. It's quite remarkable if you think about it. Though the general image of an Indian king or of an Indian general is of this passive figure who just sits on an elephant until he's killed. This is not the impression that's actually coming across from the Persian sources. They clearly see these guys as very capable, very deadly enemies. And Govindaraja is not ordering his soldiers to attack Muiz from the back lines. He's on the front lines. He's actually taking injuries and he's killing people.
And he's there at the point of maximum danger, as I'm sure Prithviraj himself was. This was perfectly normal for these guys. Of course, we don't know why exactly the Ghorids lost, but there's reason to believe that Prithviraj had a particular cavalry general named Skanda, who actually played a crucial role in this battle. But the sources for the first and second battle of Tarain are very scattered and tend to be very unreliable. So we'll be very cautious about this. What I think is pretty clear is that after this battle was over, the Chauhans didn't just sit back and rejoice. They went and took back the fort of Tabar Hind after a long siege that may have again lasted about a year.
So these guys understand the strategic importance of the fort. To them, the war is not over by any stretch of the imagination. They recognize that Muiz is still a threat. They recognize that if not Muiz, then there will be more Afghans, more Turks who are going to be raiding their territories. And so they invest in building up the capabilities to defend against that.
So now what's happening to Muizuddin? He's been defeated. He returns to Ghazna. And again, he's licking his wounds. But we get the sense that he's at a crucial point here. After these sort of defeats, any such monarch is really susceptible to the perceptions of being weak. And that's very dangerous. You could literally lose your own head. So he wastes absolutely no time in raising a new army. So again, he recruits widely. He gets infantry recruited locally from the Afghans, but he's also getting a lot more Turks this time. Cavalry, both heavy cavalry and horse archers. And so once again, this army heads down Khyber Pass through the plains of Punjab into what is today Haryana and Rajasthan. And there they meet the Chauhans once again.
So this is really the do-or-die battle for Muiz in so many ways. And we don't necessarily know if the Chauhans saw it as with that degree of importance. As far as they were concerned, yes, this guy is a persistent, obstinate, tenacious enemy, but there's no reason why they can't see him off just as they have seen off so many other horse-riding armies in the centuries before.
Yeah, and of course, now you could claim that maybe Prithvi Raj had gotten a little cocky after his victory the previous year and so on, but we really don't know any of this. And this brings me to something about the Second Battle of Tarain. Very few battles in Indian history are shrouded in as much myth-making as Tarain. Myth-making is really started in the 13th century itself, with poems, with ballads, even when you get to the 16th century, you have people like Ferishta adding their own bells and whistles to the narrative. All of these are very alluring legends, but we should be careful. A lot of them are completely at odds with more contemporary chronicles. So what I'm going to do is try and give our best guess of what happened that day in Tarain.
Of course, this is something that has been quite extensively used in nationalist myth-making by both the modern states of India and Pakistan. Pakistan, for example, has missiles called Ghori, and India, on the other hand, has transformed Prithvi Raj into this great emperor who is a defender of Hinduism, who is a defender of manly Indian virtues, and has attached so much romanticism to the man, has built up these tales of his great chivalric conduct and how he's basically made into this tragic hero who is so besotted with love for this princess whose father forbade him from marrying her that he did not see the threat coming from Muiz. And that is not really what comes across in contemporary inscriptions. Both of these are very complex individuals, and they need to be appreciated within the social, political, and martial context within which they're operating. Prithvi Raja especially, there's no indication that he did anything less than prepare well for this battle. It definitely was a much higher stakes thing for Muiz, and of course, he seems to have been at the peak of his game. From the very outset of the campaign, he seems to have entered the field thinking, I have to get into this guy's head.
I think that's absolutely right. Muizuddin is absolutely determined to control the tempo of the battle and to retain initiative. We just talked about Prithvi Raj not being this romantic figure. Let's remember that this guy is probably about 25 or 26 years old.
He's my age. Wow, okay.
Yeah, obviously people grew into adulthood much earlier than we do today, frankly. But, he's a young man, and Muizuddin is not. And he definitely has more experience on his side.
And he's also had more defeats. He's had to lick his wounds, as we've said multiple times. He's had to learn from terrible mistakes, but he's also learned how to motivate people, how to manipulate people. He's a politician, he's a general, he's a diplomat, like so many other medieval potentates. And he's got at least a couple of decades more of doing this than Prithvi Raja. And as we all know, experience adds up exponentially. So the kind of mind that Muiz is bringing to this battle is very different from the mind that Prithvi Raja has going into it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can see that from the moment the battle starts. First, Muizzuddin seems to have actually started skirmishing the previous night. According to one account, he left bonfires burning in his camp in order to lull Prithviraj into thinking they'd all just bivouacked for the night. In the meantime, they seem to have started harassing Prithviraj's camp in the wee hours of the morning, and by sunrise they had attacked the baggage camp. By the time Prithviraj's army assembled, they seem to have used a combination of both shock cavalry and horse archers in order to, in a sense, shape this battlefield very efficiently.
So he has absolute control of the terrain. He has the initiative. And though, of course, this has often been made out to be, oh, look at this evil person who is not abiding by the rules of the dharma. And this is not how battles are fought in the Mahabharata. Clearly, Prithviraj is being a chivalric knight, and that is why he was defeated by this no good, dishonorable person. That's not really how medieval Indian kings fought battles at all.
Absolutely not.
We actually know from Kautilya's Arthashastra, the defining book of Indian statecraft, which, at least in my experience, corresponds much better to medieval political realities than it's commonly made out to be. Kautilya explicitly says that night operations are something that a king must specialize in. It's a great way to bring an asymmetric advantage to your opponent. And we have absolutely no reason to believe that kings did not do this. Just logically speaking, it makes sense to do stuff like this, just tactically speaking. And it's not a great innovation to say, okay, if my enemy expects me to attack at time X, let me instead attack at time Y when he does not expect me. That is literally strategy 101. And it seems that Muiz decided to do that. And as a result, at dawn, when these two rivals were facing off each other from across the battlefield, Muiz would have seen this young man probably just sprouting his first proper coat of like facial hair, obviously dressed in armor, mounted on a great elephant that was bedecked, painted with great tusks covered in barbs. You would have seen a very colorful but very numerous and well-trained army that, though they were slightly on the disadvantage, though they would not have had the best night's rest, because a lot of them would have been occupied with fighting through the night. A lot of them would have been putting out fires that the Turks would have been lighting through the night. These guys were still not on their last legs. They still had plenty to give, and they were still ready, willing, and able to fight. So by no means has the battle swung in Muiz's favor yet. It's just slowly starting to shift.
Exactly. If you were a Turk on horseback wielding a lance on that dawn, you're not thinking, yay, we've already won. You're thinking there's a very hard battle up ahead. Where I think we have to give the Ghorids credit is that they exploited the Turkic way of war to its fullest. You use heavy cavalry wielding lances charging at you in order to force the enemy to coalesce. And then that makes a perfect target for horse archers, which then forces them to scatter. And then you again hit them with heavy cavalry. And in this way, the enemy is constantly reacting. This reminds us of Sabuktikin's own battle against the Shahis, where something fairly similar was done. One thing that stands out about Second Battle of Tarain is that Muizzuddin actually kept some reserve cavalry. And so once these guys were sufficiently weakened, he had this reserve cavalry charge right into the Chauhans and finally scatter them.
Let's just recap this to break down the sheer, how do I put this, nail-biting tension of this kind of back and forth. As you said, the outcome of the battle was by no means predetermined. I'm assuming that the Chahamanas had a very good sense that this is how Turks generally fight, but there's a number of new things that have been introduced into this mix. The first is, of course, that Muiz has gone out of his way to recruit the largest army perhaps that he's ever recruited. So large that he has possibly hundreds, possibly thousands of heavily armored, lance-wielding shock cavalry waiting in reserve. And this is after he has spent an entire night harassing the enemy. So he's come to the battlefield with this idea that I'm slowly going to spile up the advantages that I have, and I'm going to kind of shift the tides of the battle in such a way that the Chahamana's responses to my strategy are reduced and my advantages are increased. And what are these advantages that Muiz is going for? First of all is that he is fresher than his enemy is. Second, he knows what's happening, the enemy doesn't. Third, he has control of the terrain. He can move. He can move around Prithvi Raja's armies. He can disperse his squadrons. And even though Prithvi Raja would have been used to the Turks doing something like this, he might very well have made mistakes in the heat of the battle. His commanders might have been overconfident. There might have been troops that committed to fighting the Turks or exited their line a little too early. And even if these are really, really tiny mistakes, these make absolute tactical sense in the heat of the moment. They very quickly start to add up when you have an enemy who's watching, who's waiting, who has the initiative, who controls the battlefield, who moves faster than you. And you can see how Muiz slowly draws them further and further out. He exhausts them over the course of the entire day. He reduces the army's morale. And slowly, keep in mind, this is a force that just last year sent him running back to Afghanistan with his tail between his legs. They're already terrified. They're already demoralized, but they're not done yet. They're exhausted, they're wounded. A lot of their brothers in arms, their comrades, are lying dead on the battlefield, but they're not done yet. And then this huge force of heavily armored shock cavalry just punches into them and shatters them to pieces.
Now, what does Prithvi Raj do? According to Persian accounts, he was on an elephant and he leapt off the elephant, hopped onto a horse, and was trying to make his way out of the battlefield when he was captured and executed. From what we know, from what typically happened in these battles, the king would be beheaded, his head would be put on a pike or a lance, and would be paraded in front of the victorious army. And that is most likely how Prithvi Raj's life ended. Now, there are some who think that after he was captured, he was actually made into a vassal, and they point to numismatic evidence, basically coins of the Charmanas from a little later in that period. But this would appear to actually be his son. What seems to have happened is that Muizuddin actually let Prithvi Raj's son rule as a vassal.
I've come across another source claiming that Muiz let Prithvi Raja live, but then happened, as a vassal of his, of course, but then happened to visit Prithvi Raja's court and found that Prithvi Raja had commissioned a gallery of paintings depicting him as a pig, which of course Muiz was really, really pissed him off and led to him executing Prithvi Raj. But of course, there is a myth on the other side as well.
Absolutely. This whole battle is just a whole accretion of legends. For instance, the Prithvi Raj Raso, which is a wonderful ballad, tells us about how he was captured, taken back to Ghazna, blinded.
Now, what happens next, according to the Raso, is that the poet himself, a man called Chand Badai, because of loyalty to his master, actually goes to Ghazna and sings Prithvi Raja's praises like absolutely madly, saying, "Oh my God, he's such a great archer. Oh, you blinded him. Oh, don't worry about it. He's still a great archer. He can shoot any target that you think about." And what does Muiz do? So, of course, Muiz, as we know from real life, was clearly a very stupid individual who never learned from mistakes and knew to trust his enemies and was absolutely easy to take in by any guy who just randomly showed up from India and told him a story. He organizes an archery contest in which a blind man is supposed to participate, which seems like something that a medieval king would do, right? Absolutely makes sense. So what happens is that at this context, Chand Badai yells out to his friend, and this immediately gives Prithvi Raj an idea of where the poet is, which he knows that Muiz must be somewhere close by, and then he shoots Muiz, and of course he is bravely executed, and so is Chand. It's a great story, but it doesn't really have a lot of historical value.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no evidence that any of this happened. It's at complete variance with everything we know about both Prithvi Raj and how Muizuddin died. So while we can enjoy these stories, let's not believe they're true. There are people, for instance, who think that Prithvi Raja's grave still lies in Ghazna. There's absolutely no evidence for this. And this myth-making continues today. There are these equestrian statues that you will find today of Prithvi Raj. You'll find them both in Rai Pithoda in Delhi as well as in Ajmer. And if you look at the one in Delhi, it portrays our man as a horse archer.
A horse archer,
which is quite weird,
and he's actually wearing a pajama, if I'm not wrong, a kurta pajama, like a Mughal king.
Exactly.
And he's got a nice thick mustache, nothing like a 25-year-old can grow, as I can secretly attest. But it's just interesting to see how the images we have of both Prithvi Raja and Muiz don't necessarily correspond to the complicated and in a lot of ways really messed up portraits of these individuals that emerge from contemporary sources.
Absolutely. And now Muizuddin finds the field open to him. He's now just mopping up the last bits of resistance. And this defeat of Prithviraj ends up being really one of the most consequential battles, certainly in the subcontinent's history, because it really opens up the gates for a mass migration of military manpower from Afghanistan. You see Khalajis coming in, you see Ghuz and other Turks coming in, and all of these people are looking for opportunity of their own to serve either under Muizzuddin or even just by themselves.
There's a number of Ghurid generals now who are basically, as Muiz returns to Afghanistan in triumph, to the Muslim world, the way that he is made out to be, as if he's some kind of Saladin in the West. Now, for a little bit of context, Saladin is this very, very famous Muslim leader in the Middle East who is revered for fighting off the Crusades and is revered for being chivalrous, letting defeated enemies live, protecting pilgrims, except in a few highly noteworthy instances. But he's a very different sort of man from Muiz. We talked a little bit about Muiz's psychological makeup. He's not a gentleman. He's not a urbane individual like Saladin is. But this enormous victory suddenly grants him this great deal of legitimacy. And just as Mahmud of Ghazni did with all that he gained in India, Muiz chose to go and spend that in Afghanistan and in Central Asia. And that basically left the field open to his ghulams. We know of a number of them. There's Nasir ad-Din Kabacha, Taj ad-Din Yildiz, a chap called Toghril, and of course one guy, Kutubuddin, who is popularly known as Aybak, but Aybeg, to differ, he was a Turkish beg, like all these other guys. These are guys who operate within the Turkish context, so I will henceforth refer to him as Aybeg. So essentially, these guys are all now starting to compete with each other for power, just as all the Ghurid princes once did in Afghanistan. And keep in mind that they're highly trained military minds. These guys know how to fight, they know how to kill, and they are basically turning northern India into their playground. The reactions that we have from Indian sources are of absolute doom and despair. As you said, this is clearly one of the most significant military upsets in human history. For the Indians, it's like a world is ending and they do not know what can be done to counter it. We talked a little earlier about how Prithviraja in legends is supposed to have had this romance with this princess whose father did not want him to marry her. This was the Gahardwala king Jaichand. The Gahardwalas fascinating polity rule over most of the Ganga Yamuna Doab. And you can see in Gahardwala art really a lot of the things that you see in later North Indian art as well, especially the large, beautiful, stylized eyes and so on and so forth. But Jaichandra, or Jaichand as he's made out to be in the Prithviraj Raso, is actually killed in battle with Muiz ad-Din. And we have an inscription that was left by Jaichandra's nephew. Now, I quote from B.D. Chattopadhyaya's excellent book representing the other Sanskrit sources and the Muslims 8th to 14th century, which I cannot recommend enough. It really helps you understand medieval India like very few other books I've come across. Now, I quote, "The inscription states that Maharaja Ajay Simha, who is the nephew of the Gahardwala ruler Jaichandra, and his acharya and priest performed a Mahayaga of Chandika. It also refers to the installation made earlier of an image of Durga, but now with great sorrow, touching her with my head, I placed this Durga, the dweller of the fort and destroyer of bad luck, into this pit until the god Skanda turns their, which is referring to the Turks, turns their glory to dust. When ill fate meets Yavanas, who again are the Turks, she might reappear or manifest herself again amidst uproar." So there's a sense of doom, but also a sense of resolve that it's not over. The fight is not over, and in no way is the fight over. You mentioned how a number of new peoples are now moving into North India, among which are the Khalajis. Now, one of these individual called Bakhtiyar decides to make a name for himself, and he finds that it's not as easy as he would like to think. Now, at this point, we'd like to bring in our friend Malvika Pradhan, who we introduced in the beginning of the episode. So, Malvika, tell us more about this Bakhtiyar chap.
Bakhtiyar was quite an interesting guy in the sense that you have stories about how he was initially apparently rejected for military service by Aybak, or as you like to call him, Aybeg. Mm-hmm. Apparently, Bakhtiyar was quite short in stature, his arms were disproportionately long, and it's not a very flattering, description of the man. However, as you guys have spoken of earlier, it was a time of great turmoil. People were trying to make a name for themselves, and Bakhtiyar managed to turn his attention and focus to the areas of Bengal, Water Bengal, and Bihar. he actually obtained a lot of ample resources in terms of getting men and material and horses.
I'm just imagining this short, bow-legged man with disproportionate arms going around yelling at people and saying, hey, let's do this, let's go and kill these infidels. And I can imagine that there would have been large numbers of people who had basically come from the mountains of Afghanistan who saw this land of bounty before them and said, this guy seems to be onto something here.
Well, you can definitely speculate, but what we do know is that he definitely did raid Bihar extensively. And it was culminated in the sacking of the two cities of Uddandapur and Vikramshila. And Juz Jaini, who's a contemporary chronicler, describes the city of Uddandapur as, a madrasa, or it's a vihar basically. It's a center of learning. He said it was inhabited by shaven-headed monks, which we can infer were Buddhist monks. Jajani says that they were all slain, and to the extent that there was nobody left to even let the conquerors know what the books in the vihar actually were about.
Obviously, this university does not look like any universities they might have come across in Afghanistan or in Central Asia, if they had come across any of those. And you have to kind of imagine the kind of greed and ignorance it takes for you to see a bunch of undefended people and then just go around killing them because you're overtaken by this mass bloodlust. These guys are nothing like the later Muslim kings that you see in India. These guys are not educated. These guys don't understand what they're doing. And it's only nationalist myth-making that leads us to believe that they are in any way the same people. These are just a bunch of idiots, essentially criminals, who have come in to make a quick buck for themselves, and to compare them to somebody of a totally different class, probably totally different ethnicity, who speaks a totally different language, who comes at this from a totally different cultural context, is utterly ridiculous. But sorry, Malvika, tell us more. So what exactly happened to Vikramshila after these guys realized that there was nothing there worth sacking?
Well, for a start, all the monks were slain, as I mentioned, and there was nobody left to even translate those random leaves with squiggles on it, as you call them. You could see Uddandapur, a few years later, as is given by a nearly contemporary account of a Tibetan pilgrim named Dharmaswamin, who visited eastern India about 30 years or so after the event. And Uddandapur has been, by that time, converted into the residence of a Turushka military commander. He might be exaggerating, but Vikramshila was essentially in ruins. And in Nalanda, which is, the great university that we associate with Bhaktir Khilji, all you could see were these 80 ruined little, viharas or structures, of which, there was nobody left to make any offerings. It wasn't, in use. Barely two of them were even, barely serviceable. But the thing that, we need to talk about and we have to talk about is what the king of the land was doing at the time. I mean, obviously, the kings in the subcontinent were nobody's fools. They realized the huge threat that, the Khiljis and, the Ghoris posed. So what were those guys doing, right? So the ruling dynasty in the land that time were the Senas, and Lakshman Sena was the king in question. And it's logical that, he wouldn't have rolled over. I'm sure he fought. He probably gave them hell. In fact, you have him eulogized by his court poets, who probably were, the PR guys of the day. But so we might want to take it a bit of salt. But still, they call him a smiter of Turushk forces. They say that, he kills any Yavan who goes there and that there's none that can vanquish him. However, you also need to temper that, obviously, with the realization that, yes, those guys, his poets were essentially his PR guys. And also the fact that, there's this sense of doom, right? Try to put yourself, in the shoes of people of that time. You have this huge force that is coming out of, the mountains in the west, and they've conquered kings, and, there are people dying before them.
The entirety of the Gangetic Valley, which would have been your entire world, covered in all these cities, perhaps families, people that you knew, who you're friends with. It's all been totally upended by these, who you would see, let's face it, you would see them as barbarians.
You would see them as barbarians, which is why they're called Yavans and Mlechas and a whole host of extremely unsavory and unflattering terms. But there is this huge sense of doom. So again, Juzjani, who is a contemporary source for the times, he says that although the Sena king could not be persuaded to leave his capital, which again makes sense because the king would probably want to, hold his ground and not go down with his ship. But you had, inhabitants, fleeing further inwards into the country. before these approaching forces. And Bakhtiyar Khilji was encouraged because he got a robe from Aibek, and which definitely signifies that your master's happy with you.
Which is so interesting, because we talked earlier in this podcast about how Mahmud of Ghazni, after his military successes, received a robe of honor from the Abbasid Caliph, signifying that he'd arrived. And Bakhtiyar, though he had been rejected from service by Aibeg or Aibeg's officers, was now given a robe of honor by Aibeg himself.
Yes, so it's, clearly a robe is definitely a sign that, you've arrived, and it encouraged Bakhtiyar. He, ventured further inward into Bengal, and finally he drove Lakshman Sena to the towns of Sanakat and Bang, where, it said that, Lakshman Sena's reign came to an end, or as they say. And this is something really interesting. There's talk of a sacrifice, a yagya that Lakshman Sena conducted, which is called the Aindri Mahan Shanti, and it was done to, propitiate the gods and to avert a huge calamity. Now, it's all very well for, someone to sit here and say, what's the point of conducting a yagya? But look at the optics of the yagya. Imagine you're like a terrified inhabitant who's fleeing inward, and you have this huge, sacrifice, this huge puja being conducted.
Yeah, Indri Mahashanti quite literally means the great peace of the lords, or of the Lord.
Exactly. So it definitely would have tried to serve as some sort of calming effect, or, some sort of morale boosting event.
I'm just imagining Bengalis of all castes, all classes, all gathering together to watch this sacrifice with this feeling of impending doom, this feeling that a world that they knew is ending and that a new world is going to be starting, and they have no idea what that world is going to be. But I would imagine that just the very act of bringing all these people together, seeing once and for all this great expression of the religion that you've grown up believing in, seeing the gods that you've always prayed to, that you've always propitiated, being entreated to have mercy on all of their subjects by the king himself, your leader, the person that you quite literally look to as the representative of the god's authority on earth. It must have been a great and terrible moment.
I can only imagine. And again, it must have also been a huge morale boosting moment, right? Imagine you're a soldier who has to go and face these, invading forces. You have the gods on your side. You're definitely going to be fired up.
But even if when you have the gods on your side, Bakhtiyar Khilji's army must have been an absolutely terrifying sight. Over there in the fertile plains of the eastern Ganga, you see these masses of horsemen riding in, destroying everything in their wake. People would have seen nothing like it.
Bringing with them those curved scimitars that we now associate with all Indian kings, but were introduced to India by these people that Indian kings would have seen as savages.
Or even just the sight of those horsemen and their sheer skill on their horses. You've never really seen anything like this. Someone who, and his horse were like, for all intents and purposes, move as one. We've heard how they'll be able to shoot arrows even while retreating. Nobody's seen something like this. I'm sure it must have been a novel and completely terrifying sight. So, in fact, after ending the reign of Lakshman Sena, Bakhtiyar Khilji got even more ambitious, and he, wanted to reach Tibet. He wanted to open the eastern gate of Hind. And what he did was he put together an expedition that went all the way up to the Brahmaputra in Assam, where apparently they were met with destructions. What happened was that although they reached what they would call the open country of Tibet, which probably would be modern-day Bhutan for us. So they were met with people whom they called Turks, were archers, and had long bows. And after being made to retreat from there, the army was starving. They had probably lost their baggage train, or, it was, for all intents and purposes, an ill-fated mission, so it probably had not been planned very well. But this starving army they ran into the mountain tribes at Kamarup and were then cut to pieces on apparently spiked bamboos.
It's almost a cathartic end to Bakhtiyar Khilji. I can just imagine him becoming more and more confident, almost gloating in the fear that he's spreading around, going into these mountain passes thinking that somehow he's going to find a way through them, and then it's slowly dawning on him that he has really messed up. Losing his way, being attacked at every single pass, every single crevice, having to abandon their baggage, running pell-mell down the slopes, and basically straight into the arms of tribes who have been watching them for months and have been planning how they're going to systematically slaughter them. And that's the last we hear of Bakhtiyar, right?
Yeah, so Bakhtiyar apparently either died of disease or was assassinated after this mission. But the thing we need to really take away from here is that there's this narrative that's, sort of been put about that these men had it easy, that, they just rolled in like bosses and, steamrolled all opposition. That's not true. They were resisted. And in this case, at least, they, successfully resisted. So we need to understand that, it wasn't easy to, get into the subcontinent. And the kings and the tribes, they fought for every inch of land that they had.
Absolutely. Every inch of land is quite literally what happened.
But of course, it was easier to resist in some places than in others. It's much harder to fight off these mass cavalry armies in the plains. It's much easier to do so in rougher, uneven terrain like the mountains. And that's why you see a lot of the resistance, most effective resistance, really coming in these fringes. This also suggests that there is something to say about the possible ecological and geographical limits of such an army. That's something we're going to get into in future episodes.
What is most remarkable to me is the fact that while Bakhtiyar's superiors, while Muiz, while Kutubuddin Aibeg, and while even further back, Mahmud of Ghazni themselves, all clearly understood how to use terrain. Clearly, as military men, they're a very different beast from Bakhtiyar. Bakhtiyar is basically this, ambitious chap with apparently a Napoleon complex who sets out to make a name for himself and whose career seems to have been aided by the waves of fear that he was spreading through horrifying acts like what happened at Vikramashila, for example. And you can see that the second that he's put out of his comfort zone, he fails to adapt and he pays for it very, very dearly. Really, all the classic signs of a totally incompetent commander are right there waiting to be seen. He's not some kind of fearsome demon as later narratives have made him out to be.
All right. So now let's go back to where the really competent commanders are back in the West. You have, of course, Muhammad of Ghor himself. You have his right-hand man, Kutubuddin Aibeg. And in 1206, at the time that Bakhtiyar Khilji dies, they're campaigning against the Ghakkar tribes in what is today Khyber Pakhtunkhwa of Pakistan. Once that campaign is over, they've wrapped up everything. They camp by a river. And one night, a group of assassins enters Muhammad of Ghor's camp and, according to a chronicler, stabs him or wounds him 5 or 6 times and kills him. And then these assassins apparently disappear. Now, we don't know who these guys were. Maybe they were the Ghakkar tribes themselves, because another chronicler points out that Aibeg's campaigns against the Ghakkars were very brutal and there were very few people left standing at the end of that campaign. So was it someone taking revenge? Was it something that Kutubuddin Aibeg himself engineered? These are one of those, everybody will have their own pet theory about this. But what we know for sure is that Muhammad of Ghor died. And so imagine this. You have Bakhtiyar Khilji dead. You have Muhammad of Ghor dead. And now there's a power vacuum.
How fascinating. From the top of my head, I can think of any number of polities, any number of very powerful people within South Asia, of course. Leaving aside Central Asia and everything that was going down in the court of Ghor itself, there must have been a lot of people who basically saw it as being in their best interest that Muhammad of Ghor died. And as you subtly implied, it's quite possible that Kutubuddin Aibeg was responsible in some way, or at least knew about his master's death. We have to keep in mind that the relationship between a ghulam and his master is not necessarily as rosy as the ghulams would like us to think it is. Kutubuddin made his name under our friend Muiz. He was actually present at the Second Battle of Tarain, where Prithvi Raja Chahamana died so memorably. It's quite interesting to think that the same person who was responsible for rejecting Bakhtiyar Khilji's attempt to become a Turkish soldier and failed in that attempt, basically let this man rampage, do whatever he wanted with the eastern part of India, now finds himself in a much more competitive environment in the West, right? Of course, you have his master, Muizuddin himself, who was around up to this point, the titular sultan from whom all these ambitious ghulam warlords are getting their legitimacy from.
Yeah, I'll just point out that Muizuddin is Muhammad of Ghor.
Yeah, in case there was any confusion about that, Muizuddin is Muhammad of Ghor. So, as I was saying, it's so interesting to me how Kutubuddin seems to understand that he cannot be as powerful as he otherwise would as long as Muhammad is around. As long as there is a sultan, the great bigs can't really get away with that much. But now that Muizzuddin is off the scene, all of a sudden you start to see a very interesting new dynamic emerging.
Yeah, you have to understand that after the Battle of Tarain, after defeating Jai Chandra in the east, Muhammad of Ghor, or Muizzuddin, did not go and set up an empire there immediately. He really just went back to Ghazni. And he left behind Qutbuddin in Delhi. Also in Punjab, there was another man, Kabacha. You have these three power centers. You have in Punjab, you have Kabacha. In Ghazni, you have Yildiz. And in Delhi, you have Qutbuddin Aibeg. And this is really where the rivalry starts.
Now, because of the death of Muizzuddin, Qutbuddin Aibeg is suddenly the most powerful of all the Turkish begs. But there's one other who can challenge his authority, and that guy is a chap called Baha al-Din Tughril. Now, Tughril's rivalry with Aibeg really lays the foundation in a lot of ways for what Turkish or Turkic polities based in India will look like in the future. Now, we talked in a fair bit of detail earlier in this episode about the Chahamana king Vigraha Raja. And we talked about how Vigraha Raja was fighting with a number of other small Chauhan families. While all these other big guys are positioned in Ghazna, while they're positioned in Punjab, while they're positioned in Delhi, now you have this fellow Tughril who's also setting out to make a name for himself in Rajasthan. So he and Aibeg are now basically competing for influence. The game to see who will be master of Western India is down to between Aibeg and Tughril. Now, Tughril understands that to a great extent his success depends, of course, on the aura of success that he has. Just as for Muizzuddin, constantly winning battles was an overriding priority, just as for Bakhtiyar Khilji, winning battles proved to be a way to get more and more manpower. Tughril himself seems to have done something similar. Now, this guy, in a lot of ways, begins the pattern that really pops to mind when we think of a sultan, right, in India. And unfortunately, it's a pretty negative stereotype.
Yeah.
Tughril was a guy who saw that destroying temples was a great way to make a name for himself. Just as Mahmud of Ghazni was destroying temples in order to make a name for himself within the broader Islamic world, Tughril was going around destroying temples in Western India, especially early Rajput temples, and using them to build mosques. But why was he doing this? It's not like he was interested in what the broader Islamic world thought of him, who is basically this ghulam in the middle of nowhere, right, as far as the Islamic world is concerned. But the people who do care about Tughril's success are the other Turks in
Exactly.
India.
This is competitive iconoclasm.
Exactly. Comparative iconoclasm is a great way to put it. I was reading this fascinating paper by Alka Pandey, who I think is one of the most interesting people writing on the Sultanate at this point. And she says something on the lines of, within the course of about 7 years, Qutbuddin Aibeg and Tughril, between the two of them, built larger and more impressive mosques or permanent establishments in India than had ever existed in that part of the world for centuries. And keep in mind that we are talking about a very large period of time, right? Islam had come to Western India already by the 7th, 8th century and had been building buildings, of course. You had interaction between these communities. You had multiple ethnicities, multiple forms of religion, which we talked about in the previous episode. But none of these communities had seen a need to build anything as in your face as a mosque that's built out of the demolished parts of a temple. But Tughril and Qutbuddin Aibeg both see this. Both of these guys are very ambitious warlords who are out there to make a name for themselves, who want all these streams of basically criminals who are flooding into India at this point out to make a name for themselves through rapine and loot. They want to attract those people to their courts. And keep in mind, there's an entire elaborate system, right? Just as how in medieval South India at the time, there's a sophisticated system of hierarchies, a system of ranks that are used to define where each man stands in relation to the other within this power hierarchy. You have something similar with the Turkish ghulams as well. So, for example, you will see them giving out to each other titles such as the Lord of the Stables, or the Keeper of the Hunting Leopards, or the Personal Cupbearer, or the Keeper of the Wardrobe. And we know that Aibeg, for example, Kabacha, who you mentioned earlier, these are men who had held those titles for various other ghulams or for Muizzuddin himself. And you have to keep in mind that these guys, as they're going around invading India, sacking cities, destroying temples, setting up forts, setting up temporary presences near cities, interacting with Indian rulers, as they're doing all this, they're going out of their way to essentially now present themselves as rulers both to the Indians they're interacting with, and also now to their Turkish ghulams. So they're giving out these titles to Turkish ghulams, but they're also using symbols that we would really think of as being associated with Indian royalty or Persianate royalty, if you remember the discussion we had in our last episode. We know they were giving out symbols of royal authority. According to Peter Jackson, who is another military historian of the Delhi Sultanate, he says that these symbols could include the Taj, the Takht, the Durbash, a sword of state, the Kaukaba, the large kettle drum, the kus, the dais or sofa, and the black, red, green and vermilion umbrellas, elephants and robes of honor. Now, keep in mind that in the Indian context, handing out kettle drums, handing out official swords, handing out umbrellas, handing out particular items of clothing
are all very familiar.
Exactly. These are very well established in Indian royal culture. So it's hard to look at all this and not come away with the conclusion that yes, certainly these guys are absolutely ambitious, power-hungry people who don't particularly go out of their way to respect their Indian subjects' religion. But at the same time, they are not absolute fanatics. They are politicians first and foremost. They realize that the audience that they are performing to are the guys who hold these titles around them, the military men who could potentially strip them of power. But they also realize at the same time that they can't totally alienate their new Indian compatriots, their new Indian subjects. And so you can see they're adopting some elements of Indian iconography as well. Qutubuddin is actually a great example of this. He's best known, of course, for his Kutub Minar, this enormous victory pillar that he built in Delhi, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. But if you look at the mosque that Qutubuddin builds, you see that while he destroys temples, the way that they're reassembled to make a new mosque is actually quite sophisticated. It's not just you build a mosque out of whatever parts of whatever temple you can find. He actually seems to have artists, seems to have qazis, scholars of Islamic jurisprudence, who look through the ruins of temples that he's destroyed and categorize them as to how they can be used. So for example, some of his mosques, you'll see that the bottommost part of the pillar will usually come from an older temple, will have less decoration, whereas the higher parts of it will come from newer temples, will be much more fantastically elaborated. The idea being that the faithful, the Muslims who are walking down at eye level, will not see very highly ornamented pillars because you aren't supposed to see them in Islam. But if you look up, then you will see symbols of victory over a subjugated population. And as I was saying, it's difficult not to look at all this and to recognize that the minds that are at play here are not the minds of simple and educated fanatics.
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, the Quwwatul Islam in Delhi, which is the perfect example of this kind of mosque, the mosque isn't just about keeping the faithful happy. I mean, there's simple aesthetic choices there, right? When you stack two pillars one on top of the other, you simply create a more imposing structure. So that's also part of the competitive architecture that these guys are engaged in. And it's strange to imagine, we look at the Kutub Minar today and think, oh, what a wonderful building. But it's really being built, at least the construction starts at a time of very violent competition, and it's really a product of this violent competition.
And it's not just competition between the Turks and Indians as it's often thought, but also a product of competition between Turks themselves.
Exactly. There are so many subtleties in this competition that are actually lost to us. A lot of this is really about where the networks of loyalty lay, and those networks of loyalty would have come from, who's been a ghulam to whom, who knows whom, who fought with whom in what battle.
Who married whose daughter.
Who's married, exactly.
Who gave gifts to whom, who received titles from whom.
You talked about daughters. The women are almost completely absent from this, but clearly the wives, the mothers, the daughters were playing a big role in this. They weren't just pawns. They were influencing their husbands. And, that was again part of the dynamic. Another dynamic is what tribe or what clan you belong to. This is completely lost, by the way, in discussions about medieval Indian history today because it seems irrelevant to us. But, back then, for instance, you talked about Tugril. Tugril was a Khitan. We talked about the Kara Khitan in our last episode. These were an astonishing nomadic tribe who combined elements of Chinese courtly culture with Persian and Turkic culture, one of those absolutely polyglot, multicultural societies. And he comes from there. Where did Qutubuddin Aibak come from? Typically people say Turkestan. Turkestan could mean basically a whole swath of Central Asia. He possibly came from what is today the province of Xinjiang in China.
How interesting.
Yeah. And so, there are clan differences. Are you a Khitan? Are you an Ilbari? These things are lost to us, and we don't know how the dynamics played out back then. But it was clearly part of what was driving this competition.
The multidimensionality of this never ceases to really amaze me. And as do the parallels with contemporary Indian royals. In contemporary Indian royal sources, women are very rarely mentioned, but we do get a sense from literature, for example, that women played enormous roles behind the scenes. Because keep in mind, these are highly trained people, come from very wealthy, very powerful families. When they are married to people, it's a token of exchange between two families. The woman might not have much agency in the choice of the wedding, but we know of a lot of cases where it's clear that women were working behind the scenes and eventually did manage to emerge into the light of history, as it were.
Even if you are doing research in modern history today in the archives, what you're not going to capture there is what pillow talk went on.
Exactly.
And that's even more so in medieval times. And so there are these elements of history that we must be aware that we don't know about them.
Why even restricted to pillow talk? We have no idea what the women of these men's harems were talking about to each other. We don't know whether they were going out, whether they had their own agents, whether they were lobbying for influence in their husbands' and fathers' courts and their brothers' courts. And keep in mind, again, it's a constantly shifting web of alliances. All these families are interested in prestige and positioning and military success. Again, all things that we touched upon in episode 2 of this podcast when we talked about the military culture of medieval South India. Even right down to the fact that these guys are destroying temples and building new sites. You can read that multiple ways. Of course, the way that it's usually read by nationalists is that it's the glorious victory of one religion over the other, or the shameful victory of one religion or the other, depending on which side of the arbitrarily defined India-Pakistan border you happen to be standing on. But the key point really is that if you look at the fact that they're going out of the way to destroy the enemy's holy sites, show that the enemy does not have the power to protect their other holy sites, whereas they are the defender of their holy sites. The fact that they're using architectural language to overawe visitors. So if you go to any temple in South India, especially the Brideshwar temple in Tanjore, for example, you cannot escape the conclusion that its makers intended for it to be a building that is meant to impose, to be a symbol of a glorious military victory, and to act as an emblem of a single family, a single individual's power. And when you look at the Kutub Minar, though it has been stripped of a lot of that context, hopefully with the context we've been able to provide you over the course of the last couple of episodes, you'll start to see that a lot of these buildings have layers of meaning, and they reveal a picture of a society that's a lot more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
And just to add to those complications, barely 4 years after Muizzuddin's death, Kutubuddin Aibeg himself dies in the midst of this competition. And he doesn't die in battle. He dies in a freak polo or chogan accident, and according to the chroniclers, his horse falls on him and the pommel of his horse's saddle pierces his chest or breaks through his chest. So pretty brutal way, gruesome way to die, but it wasn't a battle death. Now imagine this, Aibeg is dead and there's a power vacuum. Immediately, different factions try to make the best of it. In Lahore, you have one faction being set up, whereas in Delhi, another man, Shamsuddin Iltutmish, is propped up. Shamsuddin Iltutmish was himself another Turkic slave. He was probably enslaved at the age of 12, sold and resold multiple times, known for his beauty, until he came into the service of Muhammad of Ghor. And now what he does immediately is to consolidate power. He seizes Lahore and drives away his rival Kabacha, and he needs a new seat of power. He needs a seat of power for a number of reasons. One is he has enemies in Punjab and he has enemies in Ghazni. He also probably understands that something strange is happening in Central Asia. You have a people called the Mongols on the rise. So now imagine Iltutmish's dilemma. He's driven out his main rival in Punjab, but that man isn't gone yet. There is always the continuing threat coming from Ghazni itself. And Iltutmish needs to find a durable seat of power. Where does he set this up? Does he set it up in Badaun? Does he set it up in Agra? Or does he set it up on a little hill outside this old Tomara provincial town called Delhi?
Tomaras were vassals of the Chahamanas, if I'm not wrong.
Correct.
So basically the Delhi Sultanate had got its hands on this little piece of land. At some point in the last couple of centuries, it wasn't really particularly important. So why would Iltutmish decide to do something there?
Well, you can think of a strategic reason as well as a political reason. Strategically, Delhi is a pretty good place to set up a capital. You have a small number of hills, which are today what we call the ridge in Delhi, and you have the Yamuna River, and these together form a sort of triangle. So it's not a bad place to set up a city. I think the political reason is actually even more important. Remember, Qutbuddin Aibak has actually been building in Delhi, in the area we now call Mehroli. He's built the Kutub Minar, or he's building the Kutub Minar. The Qutul Islam Mosque is over there. So you already have a place where you can legitimate your power. And I think those factors come together in influencing Shamsuddin Iltutmish's decision to actually set up in Delhi. And it's really interesting that we've seen power shift. We've seen power shift from Ajmer to Lahore, and now finally to this little town called Delhi. And this has happened through the combination of catastrophic forces, gradual forces, contingency, fortunes and misfortunes of people. And that has really brought all these forces together to this little town called Delhi. And it's clear that Shamsuddin Iltutmish is thinking of this area, Mehroli, as the seat of a sultanate, a Delhi Sultanate.
If you like this show, tell your friends about us and tell us what else you'd like to learn about India's violent, complicated history. Hit us up on Twitter or Instagram. Just search for our names. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, that's Kanisetti.
And I'm Aditya Ramanathan, that's ADITYARAMANATHAN.
And tell us what you think of Yuddha. Tell us what you'd like to hear. And most importantly, don't forget to check out other interesting shows on the IVM network. And while you're at it, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IVM Podcasts.
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists, and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue, and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research, and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Racheta.
We are from the Open Library Project and we host a podcast called Paperback.
Paperback is a podcast where we engage with stalwarts and experts from various industries, suggesting non-fiction titles that contributed to their journey in a big way.
We've had guests like Anjali Raina, Dr. Marcus Rani, Dr. Swati Lodha, Ambi Parmeswaran, Apurva Damani, and many more on our show Paperback. Find new episodes every Wednesday on IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.